That's pretty much what it comes down to. Humans have rights and responsibilities. A company is not a human. Therefore, a company does not have rights or responsibilities. The sole function of a company is to generate a profit. Period. So, in terms of what we talked about last week, what do you think about this? Do you remember what we talked about last week? We talked about social Darwinism. And we said in part that if you take Adam Smith plus Thomas Malthus, you get free market capitalism. So Friedman's position, in addition to the logic I've outlined, comes down to a company has one and only one responsibility. And that's to generate a profit. Anything else, any other course of behavior is justifiable as long as it results in a profit. So what do you think about that?
Clearly, that's not good for the working class.
Yeah, that's right.
I find it to be a really good excuse that a lot of companies will use where it's, you know, oh, we're not here to take care of you. We're here to make money.
That's right. Check your personal problems at the door. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I think me and my sister actually had a conversation just the other day that may be relevant here. We were talking about how the responsibility for reducing plastic and all the problems going on with the ocean right now has been given to the consumer. And companies have been basically saying it's the consumer's responsibility to recycle, it's the consumer's responsibility to deal with plastic and all that, when the manufacturers are the ones producing all the waste in the first place. And if they were to take more of the responsibility, they would be able to have the impact to do something better.
Well, you're right. But we also want to think about two undercurrents that were not, well, they're not brought up as being an obvious part of the problem when in fact they really are. In Ethics and Entrepreneurship, we read a little bit of Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes, and the book he wrote was The Leviathan. And he says that prior to the formation of a society, humans exist in a state of nature. In a state of nature, everyone has the right to everything And because of that, life is short, nasty, and brutish. Free market capitalism is the equivalent of Thomas Hobbes' state of nature. If we couch this in Darwinian terms, it's about survival of the fittest, natural selection. So, taking the analogy of the state of nature further, then government intervention is against the laws of nature. Okay, before I obliterate this, is this clear? Anyone have any questions about this?
I had a thought that especially tied to the lecture from last week with basically the law of nature and the survival of the fittest. It just made me really think about with the pandemic crisis when people in healthcare were having to decide who gets to be put on ventilators, because especially during the ventilator shortage, they were having to make decisions as to, okay, this person has a better chance of survival than this person does, instead of it just being handed out, according to whoever came in first.
Well, you're right, and that carries through every aspect of our society. For example, if this were a class in contemporary moral problems, we would talk about organ donations. And my understanding is that in every facility that does organ transplants, there is a committee who decides based on the relative value of each person, their position on the list. So, for example, Crosby from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young got a liver transplant because he damaged his liver, alcohol and drugs. A bricklayer would not have, and then he went and did it again anyway. So when we go back to last week's lecture and talk about social Darwinism, a politician will get a new liver ahead of a bricklayer, even if the bricklayer has 6 children and the politician has none. If you think about what we're saying in terms of the overall position of people in our society, then we're in a situation where the stockholders, by virtue of the fact that they own stock in the company, than the workers. And the overall impact on society go back to what we said about Thomas Malthus last week. Inevitably, we're going to have to decide who eats and who doesn't. For our species to survive, we have to make sure that the people who are more valuable get access to scarce resources.
And the people who get to make those decisions as to who's more valuable are the more valuable people. So it just creates the circle of feedback.
That's right. It becomes a feedback loop. Brilliant. Absolutely right. So we equate capital with value. If you don't have capital, you don't have value. So if you're poor, you don't have value at all. If you recall, a few lectures ago, we talked about Sumner. And his comment was pretty direct. Shut down the city water, shut down the sewage system. Don't give them education, don't give them health care. Work them until they die. Throw the bodies in a mass grave and move on. Mass grave part I added, but in essence, that's consistent with his attitude. So when I read Milton Friedman, that's what I hear. All right, any questions so far? Okay, any reactions so far?
I feel like most of the working society right now is companies do just enough to keep people from completely rioting and talk about, oh, look how much we're taking care of you.
Yes, except one of the fundamental problems we face, according to MIT, in 2011, for the first time, the gross domestic product, which is the total of goods and services, increased while the total number of people employed went down. The article was written in 2017, and the gap between the increase in the GDP and the total number of people employed had increased. And while I haven't run the numbers, I'm sure that it has not diminished. So, for example, one of the fundamental tenets of the early 20th century was that every new generation of technology created as many or more jobs then it eliminated So when you think about this, can you see why it's happening? Anyone want to take a guess? That's why. I would argue that since around 1970, the power of Wall Street has increased. I'm going to assume that you don't know what I'm referring to or how it works or how this impacts our lives. But every quarter, analysts make a decision about my business and the percent of profit I'm going to generate. If my company fails to meet the projection, the analyst will issue a notice to sell, and people start selling my stock. The result of that can be catastrophic. So if I'm the CEO of a publicly traded company, I'm not thinking about what's best for my company or the people who work in my company. I am worried about keeping Wall Street from issuing a sell notice on my stock. Keep in mind that most CEOs are compensated on the value of the stock. They're called options. And when I was a corporate executive with a Fortune 100 company, their stock was trading at $50 a share. I had options at $20 a share. So when I bought the stock, I had to hold on to it for a very short while before I sold it. I was automatically making $30 a share. So many corporate executives, since they, quote, aren't being paid what they're worth, unquote, get stock options. Are you beginning to get the picture? Yes, no?
Yeah.
So every business faces the reality that There are only so many widgets I can sell. The market will become saturated. So I had coffee with an old friend today. And despite my telling her not to do it, she bought a new Apple phone. Apple no longer bundles a charger with the phone. I don't know. I don't know what they expect you to do, but it's $80 on top of the phone. And Apple is notorious for changing the receptacle, the port on the phone with every generation. So every time you buy a new iPhone, you have to buy all new accessories. That's an example of what they do to generate more profit. It's also why 2.5 years after you buy a new Apple product, it begins to die. They don't want you to fix it. They don't want you to replace the battery. They want you to buy a new one. Tim Cook is not paid on the basis of sustainability. Tim Cook is not paid on the basis of money given to a homeless shelter. Tim Cook is paid largely on the value of Apple. And since most major American companies have bought in the Milton Friedman attitude, they don't believe they have any moral responsibility to society as a whole. Is this clear?
Yes.
Okay. What do you think? What's your reaction? Did you know about this?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious that phones die way faster than they need to. If I can have a Nintendo 64, that still works. So it's very clear that newer, better technology dying in 2 years is a little ridiculous.
Well, you're right. But every 2 years, Apple's guaranteed to charge you another $2,000 for a phone.
Right.
And not only that, but apparently the quote unquote excuse for no longer having the chargers is it's so they reduce package waste.
Of course.
That's such a BS answer.
Well, it's like telling you that they kill the battery in 2.5 years because they're concerned about user experience. But these are part of the realities of the world in which we live. And one of the reasons why the future of our society is in such dire straits. If you go back to what we've already talked about by way of review, the United States did not want to get into World War II. But we also knew that if we didn't, in some shape or form, become involved, it was quite likely that Britain and France were going to lose. So the Lend-Lease Act allowed us to gear up to build weapons, which we then lent or leased to our allies in the Second World War. So when the war ends, there is only one industrial economy left. We also know that the soldiers who came back to no jobs. The war was over, and companies like Lockheed began laying people off. And a large number of positions in the workforce had been taken by women. So if you do the math, by 1948, our industrial complex is almost 25 years old. So what do we do? With the Marshall Plan, we decide to rebuild the world. Very noble. All of the American companies who engage in the Marshall Plan now have a virtually infinite source of cheap labor outside the United States. And all of those guys who fought, who had no jobs, we send them all to college. So, as we've said, the 1950s are the golden age. Except that by 1950, our industrial infrastructure is over 30 years old. So by 1960, because there is no incentive to be morally responsible, jobs continue to move overseas. Initially, it's to places like Mexico. When Mexico becomes too expensive, they move to Central America, South America, Asia. Wherever they can get cheap labor, they go. And meanwhile, we rapidly automate and move to a service-based economy. I do want to be clear that the problems, A, are not that simple, and B, it's not just business owners. By the late 60s, the average General Motors worker on an assembly line is making the equivalent of $70 an hour in salary and benefits. And because of the union, after 20 years, you can retire at full salary with health care.
My dad worked at General Motors for 30 years.
Okay, then you know.
Yeah.
So if somebody retired at age 40 and lived to 70 or 80, GM was paying them salary and benefits for the rest of their lives. And up against Toyota, they couldn't compete. So, for example, in 1976, if you bought a Toyota, 50% of the retail price was a tariff. Because Toyota could produce a better car than you could buy in the United States for half the amount of money. And part of the reality is that unions exist because the people who own the factory refused to acknowledge that they had a social responsibility. Remember, a few weeks ago, we said that in the 1880s, there were labor riots in Chicago. And they were rioting because they just wanted a 40-hour work week. They were working 6 to 7 days a week, 12, 14, 16 hours a day. No vacation, nothing. So at the same time that globalization is gutting more jobs, service-based jobs don't pay very much. And the cost of healthcare is spiraling out of control. And so is this also true of education.
And not only does the service industry not pay much, but then they can say, oh yeah, it's just a 40-hour work week with some occasional overtime. And then you get hired and you find out it's a mandatory extra 10 hours of mandatory overtime every single week. So you're actually working 50 hours a week.
Yeah, or in a worst case scenario, are you familiar with this company?
Yep.
You know what they did? What they do that's caused a revolution in retail?
Maybe.
Okay, give it a try.
Was it something to do with like hiring at full time, but then only working like 39 hours, so you weren't actually getting any of the full-time benefits?
Well, a lot of companies are doing that, but in their case, in the 1960s and into the 70s, and even now, Dell Computer, for example, is a big fan of something called just-in-time inventory. So, for example, in most cities, 4 times a year, you pay an inventory tax on anything that you have in inventory. And that can hurt. So, for example, back in the day when I actually knew Michael Dell and frequently went to Round Rock, Texas, if this was a Dell factory, loosely speaking, let's say that you're Western Digital and you're supplying Dell with hard drives for computers. A truck owned by Western Digital would sit on one side of the assembly plant. When they needed a hard drive. They took it out of the truck. It was checked in, immediately put into a system, checked out, Western Digital was paid, and the finished system was put on a UPS truck for delivery, which meant it took Dell less than 5 minutes to put a computer system together, which meant Dell was able to maintain absolutely minimal inventory at any given time, which kept the cost of doing business very low compared to people like HP, Compaq, or some of the other computer systems companies at the time. So Crate and Barrel said, you know what? If I analyze my business and my hours are from 10 a.m. in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, I predictably know that those are my busy times. It might come down to 3, 4, 6 hours a day when I need more than minimal staff. So how about I do just in time employment? So Falcon, you come in 11 tomorrow, stay until 1. Go home. I'll see you back here at 2. And by the way, at 3 you can leave and be back at 9. So when you think about it, other than potentially a store manager, I don't need any full-time employees. And my profit margins are higher because my cost of operation, my cost of doing business is considerably lower.
It's a lot like how a restaurant's run too.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. So,
and I guess technically there's nothing illegal about this.
No, and you see, part of the problem, to be fair, is that it's become a vicious circle. So if we think about it historically, in the 19th century, there were no benefits. Until my grandfather, my father was 40 when I was born. His father was about 70 at the time. His first vacation was during the Second World War when he worked in an aircraft factory. So much of what we've taken for granted didn't really occur until the 1950s. Benefits, healthcare, etc. So what begins to happen by the 1960s is because businesses have not been responsible, the government begins to mandate benefits. This includes unemployment compensation, which actually starts during the Great Depression, but gets more serious in the 50s and 60s, healthcare, in some cases, retirement. So if I'm a small business owner, if I take what I pay you, when I add in the benefits, I'm potentially doubling your hourly rate. Which is fine when I'm profitable. But the reality of the matter has been that since the 60s in globalization, it's been increasingly difficult for small businesses to survive. And now in an internet-based world, it's virtually impossible. So the only way I can survive is to not pay you benefits. And the only way I can not pay you benefits is for you not to work full time. So you don't. I cut you off at 39 hours. Am I making sense?
Yeah, sadly.
Mm-hmm. So even in my company, what's a 1099 employee? A 1099 employee is an independent contractor. If I hire you as a 1099 employee, I don't pay you any benefits. I also don't take out any taxes. You are on your own. And by the way, this also included Social Security. So if you're a 1099 employee, if you don't put any money in Social Security when you retire, you don't get any money from Social Security. So the point becomes that in the 19th century, if businesses had decided to be socially responsible, then the impact of unions and mandatory benefits would have been different. So now, between small business owners who can't afford to carry the weight of required benefits and large companies who find ways to not pay them, it's a pretty tough world. Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. One of the fallacies of life in the modern world is that we've lost sight of a very simple fact. Unless you do something alone in your room, totally alone, that no one can ever see or know, everything you do has social implications. The problem is not capitalism. The problem is the idea that capitalism doesn't have social responsibility. And the same is true of our society as a whole. The whole concept behind situational ethics the whole idea behind John Stuart Mill's principle of harm are not valid. Not valid for me as an individual, not valid for a corporation. And the Supreme Court's decision to treat corporations as though they were people with human rights, the case of the United States versus Citizens United, has further muddied the water. How can you have the rights of a person and argue you don't have social responsibility? Well, they argue that because we as a nation behave as though we have no social responsibility. Whether it's, I don't want to be vaccinated, I won't wear a mask, you won't take my gun away from me, or my body, my choice, or you can't tell me what to do no matter what. It comes down to a fundamental denial of the fact that all actions have social implications. What are we going to do if MIT is right? How can we have a consumer economy when there's no money to consume? At some point, the social infrastructure is going to collapse. If you think about the problem with healthcare, we knew in the early 1960s that the cost of healthcare was spiraling out of control. It was doing that because of technology, lawsuits, and a fundamentally unhealthy lifestyle. Did we address any of these? No. We threw money at the problem. And we did the same thing when the cost of higher education spiraled out of control. We called it guaranteed student loans. So 60 years later, the problems have gotten worse. And we're at, sorry?
No, I was going to say I actually have some firsthand, some really, really deep firsthand experience with healthcare being out of control. So when I, background a couple of years ago, was diagnosed with kidney cancer, had half my kidney removed. My healthcare is through Veterans Affairs. So I was able to choose to go to a quote unquote civilian hospital. And after my surgery, I received all of there were bill explanations, but I didn't have to pay them. Over $200,000. There is no way I could have paid that. There is no way with the money that I bring in and my husband, there's no way. Absolutely no way. And I had no choice in this. It wasn't like I went in for an elective procedure. This was I either have it removed and I continue living, or I don't have it removed and it will kill me.
True. But looking at this more deeply, why is the cost of healthcare high? Well, because the technology is increasingly expensive. But if I know that the chances are I'm going to face one or more malpractice suits, I'm going to give you every test I can possibly give you to protect myself. And the other thing that's happened since the 1960s for-profit healthcare.
Personally, I think that's one reason, one of the big reasons why healthcare is so expensive, because so many people now you're required to have healthcare. So therefore, these hospitals and such, especially emergency departments, will charge whatever they feel like for a band-aid.
Well, that's true. But that's again indicative of the fact that the infrastructure is broken. Example, because people don't have access to a primary care physician, they go to the ER. Because the ER can't keep up, we now have what I jokingly call fast food medical. All these walk-in clinics, all of which are for profit, or the bulk of them are. I understand Cone owns a few now. And because we don't fix the healthcare system in general, we just keep inventing more ways for people to make money on a broken system. So a friend of mine who has a major healthcare company for his or her medical insurance can now no longer talk to them directly. They talk to a company called Accolade, who then talks to the healthcare company. And of course, Accolade is for profit, as is the healthcare company. Think about this in terms of everything that we've said so far this semester. All of Western culture is a footnote to Aristotle. The problems that we face don't exist in the world of Aristotle. The intellectual paradigm of the West broke in the 17th century. We are where we are because we can't envision a solution to complex problems because we're trapped in an intellectual paradigm that's effectively dead. And this is in part why I've been telling you since the first day of class, the only real question is, what does it mean to be human? In the world of Aristotle, in the world of social Darwinism, in the world of free market capitalism, the answer to the question is to be human is to have money, power. And so we live in a culture which is inherently dualistic. You have value or you don't. This is why healthcare is a problem. Because some of us are entitled to healthcare and some of us are not. As long as we equate value with money and social status, most of the social problems we face won't be solved. If I don't think about you as valuable, then I'm only going to be worried about what my stock is going to be worth at the end of the quarter. I'm not going to be worried about whether you're going to have a job or not. And I'm not going to think about the long-term implications of the fact that I'm implementing intelligent systems that are going to cut the workforce in half. That's good for me. I'm not going to worry about charging you $80 for a charger. I only want the package weight to go down so I can save money on shipping. That's more money in my pocket. We can't think about ethical issues in business apart from the question of what it means to be human. And we're not going to solve our moral and ethical problems if we don't come up with a viable, workable answer to the question in the world in which we live. Time to rethink. Time to rethink. So as we move forward with the rest of the class, now through the end of the semester, we want to keep coming back to this question. And we want to continue to see how our answer to this question creates and addresses the moral problems that we face. Any last questions before I stop the recording and take attendance? Has this been helpful?
Yeah.
Yes, no?
Yeah, it really makes me even I guess frustrated, because we do obviously put such a value on money equals power, but then we also want to turn around and say, oh, but money won't make you happy. And it's such it's such a hypocrisy.
Yeah, it is. All right, I'm going to stop recording and I'm going to take attendance.